So I'm going to go ahead and kick this off, and I guess you can actually probably see it as I do that with the chat screen there. As I said, I'm Lisa Brush with the Stewardship Network, and again, Kyle, thanks so much for joining us today. We'll be talking about Indigenous peoples and energy justice today. I want to also just take a moment to introduce you to the Stewardship Network. In case you don't know us, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their community. So it's just a real privilege for us to work with all of you online are the great people that we work with every day in communities and online virtually to connect us 24/7 when we can't be together in person. So we're capacity builders. We want to keep you outside doing the great, amazing stewardship work that you do. And so we provide all kinds of backbone support and connection to keep you all accelerating and amplifying the amazing stewardship work that you do. We are a national and international award-winning group. We 7 years after we were founded, we were called the up-and-coming conservation organization with the right trajectory by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And we've got a next new bold initiative that we'll be sharing with you later this year. So we're looking forward to that. Partnerships and collaboratives are the name of the game here at the Stewardship Network. We work with all volunteer NGOs to international NGOs, private consultants and contractors, businesses, governmental agencies from municipal, state, federal, tribal agencies, private property owners, volunteers, schools from elementary schools to university researchers. So you name it, if you care for land and water, we work with you. So it's really a great pleasure to do that. As many of you know, our place-based member communities are the backbone of the Stewardship Network. And so those are made up in specific geographies. They're made up of all of the organizations and individuals that care for water in a given community. And they essentially do on-the-ground conservation action. So joint stewardship projects, whether that's a combined burn crew or an invasive species strike team or native habitat enhancement or all kinds of different stewardship action, and then learning and engagement. So that discussion group that I mentioned in the beginning is an example of that kind of local networking and events that we hold. I also want to thank you all online who are financial donors to the Stewardship Network. Your tax-deductible contributions enables us to do things like these free online interactive monthly webcasts, as well as all of our programming. So thank you. You can make a donation online. We now accept easy online stock donations too. So just as easy as doing it with a credit card. So thank you all for your financial support. We hold an in-person gathering each year, but last year we did it virtually, and we'll be doing it again virtually this year at the end of January in 2022. We just feel like we cannot plan to bring 450 people in person in the end of January for 3 days. And so we're going to hold another virtual event. We had a great success. People said it was some of the best online experience they've had all year. So we're going to do that again. And we encourage you to share your work. Share it by the end of this weekend. And we'll look forward to sharing the work that you do. And with that, as I said, I'm Lisa Brush here with the Stewardship Network and really pleased to be here with Kyle Whyte. So encourage you all to make use of the chat box, ask any questions that you have. I'll keep track of those. As I said, so great to see so many new faces as well as returning people. So again, welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. And Kyle, with that, I'll let you grab screen sharing and turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Lisa, and thanks for all your work organizing this, and thanks to you and your colleagues, which I really appreciate. And great to have a chance to connect with amazing folks in this network in a online format. You know, when I used to work in East Lansing, one of the highlights for me was the great coincidence that the Stewardship Network conference happened to occur each year in East Lansing. And so I remember that was just a tremendous thing to be happening in the place where I was living and working and almost every day. And especially that water ceremony that really became one of the highlights of the Stewardship Network conference, and one of the things that differentiated it from a number of other conferences. So yeah, great to have a chance to be connected in this way. And yeah, I'd just like to go ahead and begin with what I was going to present. So I want to talk about Indigenous people and energy justice. And I'll start with telling you all a little bit about the work that I do before I move into the main topic. But I'm going to discuss a lot of national issues affecting Indigenous people and climate change, and then how that is relating to these conversations about energy justice. And I'll also cover a little bit of Indigenous people's philosophy as well. So I'm hoping that you'll see sort of how some of these issues of energy, come out of different conservation and environmental protection issues connected to climate change that Indigenous people have been engaged with for some time. So anyways, to begin with, so I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and Potawatomi people are from here, but my tribe was relocated, and so we're in Oklahoma. I'm an advocate, supporter, and sometimes partner and collaborator with the tribes here in the state who do exercise sovereignty and are among the major environmental advocates and protectionists here in Michigan. And a lot of what I do has been devoted to the protection of native species in the Great Lakes region. And so, for me, it's been pretty powerful to be in this area where the ecosystems, at least the ones that remain, that our ancestors valued, are ones that I can connect with every day if I want to. I've worked for about 10 years with the Sustainable Development Institute at the College of Menominee Nation, which is a Indigenous run research and educational institute that addresses issues like climate change and resilience and sustainability, but from an Indigenous knowledge standpoint. And I'm on the management committee. I'm a founding member of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, which actively seeks to support policies and actions that protect communities of color and Indigenous communities and others who are affected by extreme burdens of pollution and other devastating environmental effects. I'm a faculty member at Michigan, and I'm in the environmental justice specialization at the School for Environment and Sustainability. And I've been also active in climate change policy and education through the climate change program of the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, which is a big tribal coalition, about 60 tribes out in the Northwest who are extremely active in taking action to address climate change. More recently, I've joined the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and we're doing a lot of work on changing environmental justice policy, but more particularly on the Justice 40 initiative, which is a way in which the infrastructure bill and some of the infrastructure policy that's happening at the national level could be implemented in ways that support communities of color and Indigenous communities and others who suffer from injustice and from historic disinvestment in infrastructure. Previously, I was on the Department of Interior's Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resource Science, and I've been an author and contributor on the U.S. National Climate Assessment, of which the plans are coming right now for the fifth National Climate Assessment. I've been a big supporter of networks that seek to advance Native folks in climate science, such as the Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences. And I've been internationally on the External Advisory Board for Ngā Pae o Te Maramatunga, which I believe is the largest Indigenous research organization in the world. It supports Maori research in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm a board member of the Pesticide Action Network, which is a longstanding anti-toxics organization in North America. So in the context that I work in, as Indian country, and I think the short of it, and I don't expect everybody to comb through this this slide. If you can even see everything on it, I just want to show it to kind of highlight a few general points. Is there's hundreds of tribal governments, tribal communities, Native people, Indigenous people in the North American context. And, for us, it's really important that our sovereignty, our self-determination, our self-governance is recognized. And so I really work in that zone of tribal and Indigenous self-governance. And, it's a significant aspect of environmentalism. I mean, we have hundreds, 100 million acres of land that we have jurisdiction, sovereignty over. Obviously, historically, it was much bigger, but we also have a capacity to influence through laws and policies and codes. And other actions that we can do. What happens in terms of conservation and environmental protection? We have millions of acres of, forestry land and, land for farming and agriculture. So it's important just to embrace that, like, we have our own governments, we have our own cultural, social, and political context, and that's sort of where a lot of us, spend most of our time. Now, in terms of climate change, I think it's important to note just how active Indigenous people are in addressing climate change. During the 2018 National Climate Assessment for the Tribal and Indigenous Peoples chapter, those of us who are authors on that partnered with the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Resilience Program and created this this tool here, which just documents all the different actions that tribes are taking to address climate change and spanning areas like planning and education and cultural continuance. And this actually doesn't include a lot of the anti-pipeline and other kind of fossil fuel resistant strategies. So it's a certain type of snapshot. But actually just within this snapshot, when we originally published the National Climate Assessment, there were like 800 actions, and now if you go to it on the Bureau of Indian Affairs website, it's over 1,000. So 1,000 actions that Native people are taking on climate change just within the context of the United States. And to sort of put that in perspective, there's really just a few million Native folks in the US context. And remember, there's about 10 million people in the state of Michigan. So, would any of you wager that there were over 1,000, distinct climate change actions being taken by, Michigan residents? And, I'd be surprised if there were, that many. And so I think it shows just how active, we are in doing all sorts of things that a lot of folks don't know about to address climate change. And again, this is a snapshot. In reality, there's a lot more that's happening. And one of the reasons why, we're doing so much to address climate change, in addition to some other things I'll mention later, tied to our historic relationship to knowledge about climate change. But we are, according to the science, among the populations that will be hit most severely by climate change. So in the National Climate Assessment, when we brought together and looked at all of the tribal testimonies and gray literature and peer-reviewed literature, we found some things which are pretty disturbing, that, for a lot of Native people, their livelihoods, their economies are at risk due to climate change, whether those are cultural economies or commercial economies. And that part of the reality, which I highlighted here, is it's not just that, climate change impacts themselves create, environmental disturbances that are severe for us, but it's also that our relationships with the United States and, relationships with states like Michigan or Wisconsin or others, they're not really in the place that they need to be to facilitate the planning that needs to take place, the policy that needs to be in place in order for us to best be able to respond and adapt to climate change. We also found that for Native folks, climate change is not just about, things like the economic impact of drought or flooding, but it's actually about mental health and about physical health. If you are from a tribe and, a lot of your nutrition is coming from local foods that you harvest yourself or people in your family harvest or society harvests, if you lose access to that local harvesting because, climate change is creating an inhospitable environment for those plants or animals you depend on, then that affects your nutrition, that affects the quality of the food you're taking in, that affects the amount of exercise you might get. But it's also mental health, because insofar as a lot of those local practices are of cultural significance and family significance, then you're literally watching things that you may have been part of for generations, kind of disappear and become harder to practice, or if you're a Native person that's maybe not so plugged into those traditions, but would like to, it's harder to get reconnected in that way to your society or to your culture. And so one of those things we found is that climate change is really about immediate health. It's not only about a loss of lands and territories that have a aesthetic or cultural significance to them, but it's the health significance, both physical and mental health. And another thing we found that was also just upsetting and disturbing is that when you think about the communities in the US that are having to actually make plans right now to resettle permanently due to climate change associated impacts like coastal erosion. It's indigenous people that are on the front lines of that, whether in Louisiana or Washington State or Alaska. And those resettlement processes are not sort of just going smoothly. There's a lot of concern about whether the federal government, whether states are really doing what they need to do to support the decision making, the planning processes. Those communities need to relocate, and relocation and resettlement is scary because before climate change, there's lots of people all over the world who have had to resettle and relocate due to environmental disruptions and changes. But what we know from that experience is that it really almost never goes well, right? Communities that resettle, they experience further economic challenges, further cultural and family challenges. And so, it's scary that Native people are sort of on the front lines of climate change resettlement in the context of the US. And certainly this is happening in other parts of the world. But tribes are, really trying to work the policy to be able to improve the situation. Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians did a full review of a congressional action plan on climate change, which was out last year. And, just to kind of give you a snapshot, we're calling for different priorities, right? We're calling for the fact that some of the issues that I just mentioned, the only way to solve them is through, community-based planning, through, not just funding to get a planning process going, but to sustain it, to implement the plan, to really think about resilience across all sectors, not just conservation or natural resources, but all sectors of society. And that the cultural aspect is a key issue, right? I think we find in the dominant society that a key reason why certain people are not taking action enough to deal with climate change is cultural. And I think for Native people, that's not always so much the issue, but it's more the issue that Indigenous people's cultures are critical motivators for doing our part to protect the environment, to address climate change. And so, federal programs, state programs need to respect that fact that for us, environmental stewardship is something that is cultural. Now, for Indigenous people, one perspective about climate change is sort of the one I just gave, which is it's an urgent issue that, a lot of us recognize is severe in terms of the well-being of so many Native people and tribal communities and families. But there's also another component to it, sort of the Indigenous knowledge component to it, and the fact that for Native folks, we've been acquainted with climate change for a long time. There's nothing particularly new about the idea of human influenced climate change. And so for Potawatomi people, we're part of that larger Anishinaabe family that includes Odawa people and Ojibwe people and other related communities. And our homeland is originally the Great Lakes, and historically we weren't separated out in the way that we are today in terms of these individual tribal entities. We were actually much more associated with a governance system that was based on the particular ways that you were connected to different territories throughout the Great Lakes region. And so people moved around a lot. They changed their social and economic and cultural activities depending on the season. And somebody could associate with more than one group, whether that was a clan, a tribe, a family. And so it was a much more fluid system where there was a basic understanding that what it means to be in a well-ordered society, a just society, a democratic society is how well that society is organized to be adaptive to a constantly changing environment around us. And so for that reason, right, if you were to ask somebody back in the day, well, who are you? They would likely speak to the different groups they were part of that were connected to the stewardship of particular places within the Great Lakes. So for Indigenous people, a lot of the basis of the knowledge system, and not just for Anishinaabe people, but for others, are these really complicated calendar kind of understandings of what you do in particular seasons and times of the year, and how that relates to cultural life and family life and social life. And because that's knowledge of how society is organized to be living in a way that is respectful of the constantly changing environment, it's a type of climate change knowledge, because people are keeping track not only of seasonal and weather changes throughout the year, but are tracking trends over decades. And so you really can't speak to Indigenous knowledge systems without, mentioning that they're actually knowledge of seasons and, knowledges of environmental change and weather patterns and rain patterns and, histories of extreme weather events and how people responded. And kinship is really a key philosophy that a lot of Native folks are kind of recovering today from some of the ways in which it was kind of denigrated and butchered by anthropologists. But I think it's important to note that this idea of living with the seasons and having knowledge of a changing environment, is one that is ethical. It's not only sort of environmental science or or social science. It's ethical too, right? And so when I think about a lot of different philosophies that are articulating kind of a kinship relationship, it's the idea that we're living in a world where we constantly experience changes, but we're also anticipating changes around us. But in some of the work that I've done, some of the articles I've published with amazing colleagues, what we found is that very few Native people actually just talk about like raw environmental change. But actually, when people talk about the changes that are happening around them, they talk about how during different times of the year, right? Like say, when you have a change in a fish population or a plant population, you talk about that simultaneously with the social activities that occur alongside of that, right? So when you get this change in the environment, that is sort of like a cue for this ceremony or this harvesting activity or this political diplomatic activity. So what people actually have is knowledge of the social, cultural, and political activities that are queued up by changes in the environment. And each of those activities is a kinship activity because it's one that people understand as carrying out a responsibility. There's a certain time of year in which people come together from different communities to engage in diplomatic dialogue. That's a responsibility. If you are queued up during a certain time of year to go out and check out the habitat of a plant or an animal, that's a responsibility. You're not just doing that for yourself, you're doing that for the sake of other people. And so that's kind of one very general way of entering into what kinship means. It's a responsibility relationship where you understand that there are different social activities throughout the year that you're part of. They're queued up by environmental change. And what's important to note about that, right, is it's not only a ideal knowledge of how society should organize, but it's also an important way in which you really understand the warnings. Because what happens when those environmental cues aren't happening in ways that you expect them to? And what if they start really careening toward changes that you don't have a lot of precedent for, maybe thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago in certain stories? Well, that means that you're not doing the kinship activities, right? Or that those are mistimed, or they're conflicting with each other, or they're just getting more complicated to plan. And so that sends a powerful signal that we need to convene and figure out what's happening. And again, given those climate change actions I was showing you that Indigenous people are part of, that's what we're already doing. And so it's both a knowledge of how to live in relation to the land and to the waters, but it's also a very powerful, visceral way of getting the signal across that things are not in a good spot and we need to take action. And one of the things I just want to note, is that when we talk about responsibility, that's not just, a superficial concept, right? But, to have a responsibility is not something you can sort of just have, or you can sort of just say that you're committed to. If you're really in a responsible relationship with somebody else, a mutual responsible relationship, it's one in which that relationship is carried out in a way that has certain qualities to it. It's a trustworthy relationship. It's a reciprocal relationship. It's a consensual relationship. It's respectful. It's inclusive, and other types of qualities. So, I think it's important to note that, when we're talking about something like kinship, and talking about responsibilities, we're actually talking about pretty deep ethical values, commitments, and behaviors. And importantly, right, when you're in a community of people, or when you're involved in multiple communities and you're involved in activities that have trust in them, for example, as one quality, those are activities that are more likely to create an exchange of knowledge, are more likely to create motivation to do the right thing, to steward the environment. And so in that way, right, Indigenous knowledge is about the fact that when those activities are taking place each year, they both are based on qualities like trust, but they also reinforce them, right? Because something like trust, or consent, it gets better, it improves the more you relate, interact with people. And so those activities throughout the year then increase people's preparation, their cohesion, their knowledge, their capacity to innovate together. And so that's kind of a snapshot of just one way of thinking about, Indigenous knowledge, where, it's really about kinship that enriches webs of community support, and it helps us be prepared for good and bad times. And so, it's not just about the type of relationship, the responsibility, but it's about those qualities like, reciprocity and how they are, attached to the actual responsibility itself. Now, historically, though, another aspect of climate change, which really pertains, we'll talk about a little bit later regarding energy justice, is, it's not enough to just understand kind of the kinship perspective of responsibility, but I think we also have to understand that for a lot of Native folks, just the very concept of climate change is just told in a way that's pretty different from some of the dominant discourses right now about climate change. We can all feel that climate change is something we need to address urgently, because it is something we can address urgently, but that doesn't mean that urgency for each of us has the same rationale behind it, or has the same perspective behind it. And, if you think about this color scheming, right? So if anything you see that's blue is a few hundred years, and anything you see that's red is a few thousand years. And we're thinking about the span of history. Oftentimes, like in a country like the United States, in the educational system, the last few hundred years is made to feel big, like that's the predominant, most important time, because that's where so much of the archives are, and so much of the culture and the education is about just the history since the formation of the United States. And there's very little information about what happened before. And I remember just being puzzled in the US education system, that you sort of get these like random educational bits about like the Greeks and the Romans and the Vikings, and a little bit about different phases in Europe, like in France or in England, and everything else is about the US, and you don't even get tribal history, except for, every once in a while a fairly insulting or subtly insulting portrayal of Native people, right? But the idea is that it makes you feel as if, everything that ever happened that's of significance is in this US industrial period, which, obviously is a period of time in which many of the environmental destructive behaviors that the members of this network are resisting and seeking to curtail occurred. And one of the funny things about it, in a bad way, right, is that when you're so focused and intent on, what's happened in the last couple hundred years, climate change appears to be a risk in a certain way. It appears to be a risk of what appears to be normal right now. And it appears to risk a certain way of life that's taken for granted as a normal way of life. And doesn't sort of, indicate this idea that for Indigenous people, but many other communities of color, that there's not really anything normal about the period in which the United States has been dominant, right? This is a period where, at least for Indigenous people, we've been colonized, been subject to racial capitalism, we've been subject to European forms of patriarchy that get, made worse with US kind of cultural and interpretive understandings of patriarchy and male dominance, heavy problems with ableism. And so, for us, right, we have much longer history that is of emphasis, right? And within that longer history, there are little bits of time that are told in stories when Native people encountered climate change and had to take responsibility for it. So in that way, it was human caused climate change. And so the idea of a human influence climate change is something that's in our history in different places. It's not something that's particularly new to this time period. You know, even if we differentiate the various factors that might create a climate crisis, but nonetheless, we've had climate crises before. And in the different storytelling traditions that, that are available, and the Indigenous people continue to tell that the solution to climate change is never, better technology. It's actually about something about how climate change, either how it's caused or how people respond to climate change that they may not have a caused, is actually a function of a breakdown in kinship relationships. So we need to restore a sense of kinship as a solution, and that's prior to or more important than focusing all our efforts on technological solutions. But I think the point being, right, is that, from a Anishinaabe perspective, just thinking about here in Michigan, we're just living in a small part of our history. This is just a few hundred years out of 1,000 years, and it's not a particularly good time of history, right? We're living under a time when the U.S. Congress has plenary power over tribal sovereignty, right? We're living under current colonization, right? That's the actual law. It's not an opinion. It's the actual US law says that Congress has plenary power over tribes. So we're in a situation of colonization. And so for us, we're actually not really trying to protect anything that's taken for granted in today's industrial lifestyle, because this is not a normal situation for us, right? When you're living under colonialism, that's just not normal. And so we're hoping to get out of the current situation. And so our solutions to climate change and way of thinking about climate change is to create a different type of world, to create a more diverse world, a more equitable world, and is not trying to coddle the assumptions of normality that inform a lot of other approaches to climate change, where there's an emphasis on technological solutions that will maintain a certain industrialized way of life that's taken for granted. So again, these historical views, I think, are extremely important to keep in mind, because a lot of what makes Native people vulnerable to climate change, is the fact that we've been dispossessed of most of our land. I think those in the stewardship network are well aware of the relationship between a community's capacity to adapt to environmental change and not only the size of its territory, but its mobility within that territory. And so if you've been dispossessed of your land, and then the land that you do have access to is either in the form of a small reservation or in the form of a patchwork of, different types of private property and government property, or if you're sandwiched next to public lands that really you don't have access to, I mean, that really makes it hard to adapt to changes. And so I think it's important for folks to note that living under colonialism is living under a time of land dispossession, and really living under a threat that the available resilience options for addressing climate change are quite challenged. We don't just have a jurisdiction as big as the state of Michigan to be able to enact policies within. The tribal territories are much smaller, and that land dispossession, and I'm not going to go over each of these things here, but just to note, the land dispossession just came about through so many different policies. It was very intentional, and when you look at some of these policies that are listed here, including the lack of implementation of the true spirit of what Native people intended with treaty rights. What you find with regard to climate change is something that's pretty scary, right? That the industries that we know through science have increased concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Those industries were allowed to take root on Indigenous people's lands. So the land dispossession of Indigenous people is what made it possible for industrialization to occur at the rapid, disorganized, and morally problematic pace that it did, which we now know has fostered the climate crisis. But also that land dispossession never went away. It wasn't like those industries set up shop and then invited us back to be in that land. Um, uh, and so the land dispossession is also a key factor reducing our resilience options. And so in that way, you get sort of this kind of circular relationship with climate change, right? Where Native people are both, we're both harmed to make way for extractive and other industrial industries, but then having been so dispossessed and destroyed, are now facing severe vulnerabilities. And so for that reason, right, I think for Indigenous people, we tell time differently, right? There's that depth time I talked about with regard to the bigger history. There's a way of telling time that relates to seasons, but kinship time is important to note because kinship time is kind of this idea of being able to tell history just through kinship relationships. And a colonization period is not one that reflects kinship, right? To dispossess Native people of land is not a very responsible thing to do. It's not a very trustworthy thing to do. It's not a very consensual thing to do, and certainly not reciprocal at all. And so in this way, right, I think for a lot of Native people, we think about history as well through changes in kinship relationships. And we certainly understand that the last couple hundred years, at least in the context of the US, has been devastating for kinship relationships. And so, we're obviously working to rebuild kinship, to reconcile kinship internally within our own communities and dealing with issues of trauma and fragmentation. But there's also just the breakdown in kinship with the societies that live nearby us, the states, the counties, the federal entities. And a lot of people don't trust those entities, and for good reason. There's not a lot of consensuality or consultation. And that affects our resilience, right? That if you're trying to respond to severe environmental change, whether it's from an energy standpoint or a climate change adaptation standpoint, you need to have consensual, trustworthy, reciprocal, accountable relationships with those that you need to collaborate with. And so I think for folks that oftentimes propose really rapid solutions to climate change, they forget that those solutions have to be grafted onto a current state of affairs regarding kinship. And just because somebody advocates for a renewable energy, that doesn't mean that they're going to enact that any way different from, say, somebody would enact a coal plant. So a couple of things just to note on climate change before I get a bit more into energy specifically is that given some of the stuff I've shared, we really need to resist these concepts that are out there everywhere about the climate crisis, that it's unprecedented. It's not unprecedented, that it's new, that somebody discovered it who's probably from a US university or someplace in Europe. We need to resist the idea of crisis and urgency where just swift action by powerful people is what's required to solve it. We need to fight against the idea that it's normal, and a number of other concepts. I won't kind of go through each one, but all of these concepts are ones that certainly there's an element of certainly there's an element of truth to each of them, but they're oftentimes wielded in a way that is deeply inequitable and that erases the variety of perspectives that are out there on climate change. So, climate science, again, I think we need to stop thinking of it as a new thing. Native people have been tracking it for a while. Neither is human caused climate change really a new thing. And again, that doesn't mean that the factors tied to human caused climate change today are like occurred 2,000 years ago. Obviously, that certainly wasn't true. But just the very concept that humans can do things that affect the climate is not something that's new. And we need to understand that oppression is a root cause of impacts of climate change, that you can't really argue that it's just the impacts itself that are what are severe to particular communities. It's always coupled with oppression and power, and that any solutions that are proposed, they need to be kinship-based solutions. They need to have consent and reciprocity and accountability built into it. And that's what I wanted to say a bit about energy justice is, right now for Native people, we're still dealing with environmental justice issues tied to treaty rights, to mining, to just segregation and racism, climate equity, which I've spent a lot of time discussing just now, issues we have with national forests and national parks and other public lands, pipelines. But one of the key issues is the energy transition. And is the energy transition going to occur in a way that empowers Indigenous people to be leaders in a new energy economy? And in a recent paper it's not yet out, so I can't give you the details, but it's coming out. And me and some amazing colleagues did some pretty wide-scale analysis. And one of the things we found is that if you compare lands that Indigenous people were on historically with the ones that they're on today, whether reservations or areas they've been relocated to, that first of all, Native folks are on lands that are more exposed than for other people to climate change risks and hazards. But we also found, I'd like to kind of skip down a bit, is that we're tribal lands are oftentimes next to federally managed lands, which oftentimes mean it's hard to kind of expand because you run into those borders. But there are also lands that are less likely to lie over valuable subsurface oil and gas resources. And we're not saying that because we're advocating for oil and gas, but what we found, right, is that Native people and their lands have not been areas that were ever understood as being really part of the US energy system. So Native people are both dispossessed and polluted to make way for oil and gas industries, but we're also not ever, attempted to be really included in it. And there's a whole history through the Council on Energy Resource Tribes of tribes trying to take leadership in the fossil fuel sector. But again, they shouldn't have had to do that. And so what we find with a lot of tribal lands is that every time the US has invested in a certain type of infrastructure or energy, we've been left behind. And so when people are talking about the energy transition and renewable energy, you'll see a lot of statistics like this, such as from the Department of Energy, that talk about the capacity of American Indian lands to house renewable energy. But the problem is, right, is that those years of disinvestment in infrastructure have made it very challenging to understand how tribes would be able to implement true renewable economies, right? And so, for example, there are a number of Native people that don't have access to electricity. There's not a lot of knowledge about where different Native individuals, especially on reservations, get their energy from, what their level of energy access is. And there are a number of tribes that rely on diesel generation. And part of that is that the Rural Electrification Administration didn't even make it to most tribes and didn't properly support tribal infrastructure, electrical development through its grant programs, right? This is an issue, of the same type as the way which the US Department of Agriculture excluded African Americans in its loan programs. And so it's important to note that there's just not, other than as sacrifice zones for large scale energy development, that, tribes have not been part of the movement to build infrastructure. And this means that for a lot of different tribes, to be able to set up, say, solar or wind or another type of renewable energy situation, that if you don't have adequate broadband or telecommunications, if you don't have adequate transportation infrastructure or water infrastructure, I mean, all those things have to be in place to then take advantage of the opportunities that are presenting themselves, especially under this administration, but also internationally. And what that means is that when people that are more privileged or members of the dominant society feel urgent about climate change and move aggressively to implement renewable technologies at a lower carbon footprint, they're not thinking about what that means for tribal people. And we could end up in a world where the most privileged people remain in control of the energy sector and develop their own economies and make them renewable, but then our communities remain dependent on them for energy and don't own a lot of our infrastructure and don't actually manage renewable energy and certainly don't provide energy to other people. And so we lose that opportunity to be able to model what environmental and energy stewardship means. And so National Congress of American Indians estimates that there's at least a $50 billion backlog overall in infrastructure investment in Indian country. And they've proposed that just with respect to energy, and these are fairly low numbers, right? There needs to be at least $1 billion, in energy programs for Department of Energy, just for their Office of Energy programs, and they enumerate other dollar values, right, that are large, that are needed for, just to kind of get the energy part going. But again, none of those amounts of money are going to amount to what they need to be unless the other infrastructure issues are addressed at the same time. And each tribe is unique. So each tribe presents a unique type of setup or issue with respect to infrastructure. And another challenge, right, is that some of these issues I'm raising are not ones that a lot of voters are informed about, right? So for example, when I look at some of the solutions that have been proposed to this problem I'm identifying, whether it's from National Congress of American Indians or from our White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, these are all solutions, right? Like say the last one, funds should be flexible. There shouldn't be matching funds. There should be a tribal set aside. Most voters don't know what those things mean, right? But these are really key issues, right? And they get into the weeds of how law and policy needs to be designed so that tribes would be able to overcome the challenges that I'm talking about. But a lot of voters don't hold their politicians accountable for the positions that those politicians might take on these issues. And so for that reason, we get kind of this issue that we're at a time where there might be unprecedented interest and investment in resilient and renewable infrastructure, but we're not getting the support from voters, from others to push politicians to really make sure that they're proposing solutions that address the exact types of dynamics that would potentially make it so that today's exuberance to invest in infrastructure simply is like other periods of exuberance for energy infrastructure that left tribes and native people behind. Another issue I just wanted to mention, but I didn't want to discuss in too much detail because it's so complicated and there's so much to learn about it. But one of the big concerns about energy justice right now is this issue of what some people call false solutions. And not all climate change solutions are created equal. And one of the dynamics that I mentioned earlier in the presentation and said I would talk about a little bit later, is this idea that there's oftentimes too much of a focus on the idea that a climate change solution is just any solution that lowers carbon footprint. That's actually not true because the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council issued some guidance that said there are certain solutions to climate change that do not empower underserved communities. So if you take something like nuclear, for example, nuclear has been extremely harmful to Native people. It itself has a high carbon footprint associated with some of the processes for generating nuclear energy, or something like carbon capture and storage, which is an attempt actually to coddle the coal industry, for example. It's a solution that seeks to be friendly and nice to an industry that not only has a responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions, but is also an industry that has treated, by and large, Native people's lands as sacrifice zones. So any solution that lowers carbon footprint, but allows some of these industries to continue their problematic behavior on the lands of tribal people, of people of color, of other communities, are solutions that we need to debate and discuss actually how viable they really are. And while obviously within politics, there's an importance to being able to compromise and so on, that's not to say that these are just issues that we should chalk up to compromise. On the other hand, many of us who are strong advocates for renewable energy, we have to admit that solar, wind power, I mean, these are technologies that they rely on different forms of mining. They rely on supply chains that have a carbon footprint to them. They oftentimes will be implemented by the wealthiest people and companies and continue to concentrate power in their hands. And so I think right now, given the exuberance for addressing climate change with different solutions, that we really have to be vigilant about not letting the equity issues be pushed under the rug. And so in a recent paper, because I was kind of frustrated with this, I kind of went out on a limb and actually said, the chances are it is too late for climate justice, that the powers that be are hurtling toward these solutions in ways that are leaving many underserved communities behind, including Indigenous people, and that we've been so focused on tipping points in terms of the environment that we haven't really thought about tipping points in terms of kinship or relational tipping point, right? And a relational or a kinship tipping point, you can just understand through kind of a basic example that, say if you have a family member, back in the day with that family member, when you grew up, you hung out all the time and so on, and you could count on that person to help you out. But maybe it's been a few decades since you talked to them and maybe even had some problems with that person that you never resolved. And so after a couple of decades, is that really somebody you can count on in the same way? And for Indigenous people, right, more extreme, we've been through a couple of 100 years of severe colonialism and the destruction of consent and trust and reciprocity. And that's created a system where it's very, very hard for any federal or state policy to occur without just doing things in a way that's not consensual or that's distrustful or so on. And so that's a kinship tipping point, and it's been passed, right? So it makes it very hard to understand how solutions would not re-entrench different forms of injustice and inequity. And I think it's important as a heuristic to actually think about things in that way. It doesn't mean that we should be less passionate or urgent about climate change. In fact, what it does is it demonstrates what we need to be urgent about. We need to be urgent about lowering carbon footprint through practicing justice, that we need to be just as upset about injustice as we are about the carbon footprint, because it's hard to disentangle them. Going back to the history parts I mentioned before, for Native people, you can't disentangle human-caused climate change from inequity because we were dispossessed of our lands for those industries to take root. And so I think it's important to tell history in that way, and it affirms a more powerful way of being motivated to protect the environment, where you can't separate out environment and equity and justice, including in the area of energy. All right, hey, good to have a chance to share with you all.
Kyle, thank you so much. It's great to have that chance to, as you said, share, and for people to kind of consider a perspective that maybe they hadn't, as they're thinking about time, just even you're sharing about when we think about time, and we have such a short view on things. And even as you talk about solutions and the kinship and the relationship, and understanding that connectivity and trust takes time to build. And that means we need to make a commitment to doing that with each other and across differences, and understanding lived experiences and everything, and all kinds of different pieces there. So thank you so much for sharing that. I wanna just share with you a couple different comments that people said. As Barb says, thanks, Kyle, great presentation.
Oh.
Lynn popped in a little bit about, Lynn Heasley said, fantastic visualization on time and historical periods, right? I mean, I think that's just so important for us to remember, that not only that time backwards, but as you say, that time moving forward. One question for you is, as we think about this pandemic time, there are lots of people talking about getting back to normal. And I think that now is a time for us to make these kind of transformational changes. And again, back to your time visual, what do you think about this moment in time as a possibility, as you said, to create the different world. Like, we don't want things to go back to normal. That's not what we're talking about doing. We're talking about a transformation here. And do you think, what's your perspective on this moment in time for creating that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have a set of key choices to make right now, and there's a couple of ways, and I think it's important to folks to remember that, you know, when I talk about these things, I kind of include myself, you know, both in kind of populations of people that are affected by injustice, but also, you know, populations of people that have, you know, privilege. So I have to kind of work on both parts of it, right? Like
Right.
many of us. And one of the things that I've learned is that we need to first just adopt the sobering reality that even though we believe that today will be different from our ancestors, that the chances are it won't be. And the same confidence we might have is the same confidence they had when they did awful things. So I think it's important not to assume that just by the fact that it's us that we're different, but also that we need to really keep in mind what's happened in history and really get that kind of consciousness where the history is in the present. And so we're also always thinking about what's different about today. I think that's the discussion we need to have. How can we make today different? And not saying that because we've forgotten anything that occurred in the past, but because the past, we're seeing it in the present. So anyways, that's a short response.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Carol, as Carol asks, she says, feeling frustrated as a white person here. One of the other things that I often say about that past as a privileged white woman is that the idea that, you know, it's not our fault, but it's our responsibility. So as you say, Kyle, kind of how can we make this different today? What can we do? So it is a responsibility, and that's that kinship relationship that we talked about. And then Kyle, I want to be respectful of everybody's time, knowing that we're getting to the top of the hour. And let me ask you to take a slightly just different perspective for a second with Kathleen's question. So she asks, do you know to what extent conservation biologists who are working towards reestablishing very large wildlife corridors are also working with Indigenous environmental groups? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, so it's a big topic, and I would say a couple things is there are some, I think one needs to keep an open mind because I've seen kind of everything. I've seen cases that I thought were like, I mean, just to kind of speak off the cuff, that I thought were like pretty bad, but then I've also seen cases that were tremendously empowering. So, and tribes are also engaging in their own national park practices, like the Salish Kootenai tribe or the Iowa tribe or others. So, so it's a variety.
Yeah, no, and maybe that's a topic for a future, because I think there are, like you say, there are examples of some that are just like they are really bad.
Right.
But then there are some that are really transformational, where there was that kinship relationship, where there was a deep connectivity and trust and listening and understanding as kind of the root of that transformational change. So Kyle and everybody else, we've come to the end of our hour together. I want to really appreciate your time and all of the information and perspective shared. And I hope that it's there's of course more that we could always do, but I just really want to thank you for taking the time. Thank you all. As always, wonderful to spend the hour with you on the second Wednesday of the month during the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. So we will look to being back together with you in September as we spin around this sun again. So Kyle, again, thank you so much.
Great.
As Carrie said, that was wonderful. So really appreciate it. Thanks all.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.